Okay, so let's get started. Today, now that we've gone through why all of this is meaningful, why all this is important for the sake of ethics, I want to look at how we apply this and how we can take a look at this, what we can look at from the composition of human nature, and how we can apply that to ethical decisions and what the right thing to do is and what the wrong thing to do is. So, we talked about briefly last time, what is the criterion for judgment with respect to natural law? So if you're doing natural law reasoning, what's the criterion for judgment to say if something is good or bad? So how do we say if something's good or bad, right or wrong? Okay, so we have to know what the situation entails. We have to know what's going on. We have to know how to describe the actions. We have to know what kinds of things are acting, what kinds of things they're doing, etc. But once we've discovered that, once we figure out who's doing what, basically, and we might even need to know for what reasons, how do we determine whether it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? How does natural law come into play?
Whether it negatively affects someone?
Maybe that might be relevant in some cases, but not necessarily. It isn't necessarily relevant in all cases, and it isn't the single criterion for judgment. Now, it's worth noting that isn't the single criterion for judgment in any of the moral frameworks we've looked at. Right? So negative effects on people, that's sort of the criterion for consequentialism, but even there, it may go beyond that, right? Because we also have to take into account what are going to be the outcomes for myself, what are going to be the outcomes for everyone else, what are going to be the outcomes in general. That's certainly not the criterion for judgment for deontology, which is rules-based. It's the kinds of things that we can and can't, ought to and ought not to do. It's not the framework of judgment for virtue theory, which is what is making you a better person, what is habituating you towards acting in the right way. In natural law, it's a criterion for judgment, right? It is a relevant factor, but it's not the end-all, be-all. So what is? How do we determine if a particular act or a particular behavior, a particular choice is good or bad according to natural law?
Does it have to be based off of what with those three types of the soul or whatever? If you break one of them, or if it's not being done, something like that.
Yeah, you're on the right track. So what do you mean? So how would you go about going against or breaking something to do with these parts of yourself? Because that has something to do with it. You're on the right track.
If a person goes and there's an argument or a fight going on or whatever, and somebody just punches somebody out of not thinking about it or something like that, they're breaking the thinking and the rational part of theirs, and they're kind of going down to what an animate kind of what animals do.
Yeah, that's a great way of describing it. So this is a simple example. So somebody they get angry for no good reason and they punch somebody else. Mm-hmm. That's wrong, right? We all kind of intuitively understand that's wrong. All of the moral frameworks we've looked at can show why that's incorrect, right? It brings about bad consequences. You shouldn't infringe on the person of others. It displays an excess of say, an excess of anger, right? So it's not courageous. And then here, it goes against one's rational and political nature. Now, political here, again, remember, means more like, so political community is the term you'll see here, which goes again, which is, so political community here is a description of people working together for common goals and common goods, right? Doing your particular part for a greater overarching good. And so, punching somebody out of the blue for no good reason, or even for, a petty dispute or a squabble or an argument or whatever, that's going against your rational nature, for one, because you're trying to solve a rational or reasonable problem, right? A dispute between human beings with something that is merely animate, right? You're acting like an animal, and we mean that very precisely. Right? Also, you're going against your political or your communal nature because you're not seeking the common good between one another, right? It's not like you're attacking somebody who in order to defend yourself or to defend somebody, which would be in that case that could be in relation to the common good. That could be in defense of someone else that you have communal or ties with, social ties with. This is violating rather than enforcing community norms. So again, what you're doing is you're acting merely like an animal. So what you're doing is you're having this part of yourself, you're acting on the sensitive and animate part of yourself at the expense of the rational part. You're undermining your own nature. You're acting against yourself in an important sense. Because the most important part of yourself, what's most distinctively human, is the rational part. So to undermine that and to act against it is acting less than human. You're not acting like a person ought to act, if that's what you are. Right? Okay. So we get norms like, don't start fights. Norms as simple as that, right? Again, because you're acting irrationally, right? You're trying to resolve what should be a reasoned dispute with something that is violent, right? With something that is not rational. In other words, you're using this for what you should use this to accomplish. We can also look at more complex cases. Before we do that, I want to look at another example that's a non-human example. I want to look at an animal example. Because again, this has to do with natures, right? And what is the nature of a person? What is the nature of whatever you're acting with or acting towards or whatever you're doing? And so, I want to emphasize this that I talked about last time, which is, well, what do we mean by naturally? Right? What is natural for something? What is natural behavior? And again, it's not merely something which sort of happens. Right? Think back to the alarm clock example. It's not something that things do as a matter of course. It's rather a matter of what things do in an appropriate way given the kinds of things that they are and the things that make them up. Right? So properly applying so if we're just talking about an animal, properly applying movement and sensation to their nutrition and reproduction and doing all the things that involves. All right. Here's our example. Yeah, great. Here's a crab.
It's kids, right?
Yeah. Those are its young.
They're like a month old, right?
Less than that. These are days old, if even.
She's like taking out the weak ones, right? The ones that
Not exactly. She's eating. Yeah. Yeah, so, all right, why do we react negatively to this?
Because we wouldn't go around eating our own babies.
Yeah, why not?
Like your daughter.
Yep, why not, though? That's right, you should not do that. But why? Now, I want to ask, because I want to clarify here. we are rational, right? We're rational creatures. So if we were to do something like this, if we were to eat children, that would become a moral fault because we have the rational capacity to reflect on our own behavior. This, even if there's something wrong with this, it's not a moral fault, right? This is not something we can, blame and punish the crab for doing. Right? But there still could be something going on here that shouldn't be going on. And I'm going to argue that it's for roughly the same reasons, at least a lot of the same reasons, that we humans should not eat our own children. Why not? What's wrong with the crab eating its children, eating its young?
I think that's an animal.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not. I mean, oh.
So is this natural behavior?
I'm sorry?
Is this natural behavior for the crab?
Yeah, probably. I don't know anything about crab.
Based on the nature of the crab, from what you know of it, is this natural behavior?
I guess for them.
You said no. Why not? Why do you think it isn't?
I feel like even as like an animal, like there's still a motherly instinct to like take care of like what you've given birth to. Like I don't think you'll see a deer eating it, you know what I mean, its child. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I feel like there still should be a sense of like, maybe I should do this, but she might have a reason that we don't understand, you know what I mean?
Okay. Now, we can say that there be some kind of instinct involved, but that kind of begs the question, right? Why is the instinct there, and why do we say that it's, the prevailing instinct or the one that should be in control, right? We can think back to when we read C.S. Lewis, and he talks about instincts and how that doesn't quite solve the moral question. If we have an instinct for something, that doesn't necessarily mean we should follow it, right? You might have an instinct to run away from danger, right? But at the same time, you probably shouldn't in every circumstance. Right? I totally had an instinct to not come in today. I didn't feel like coming in. I was feeling lazy and tired, and I felt like laying in bed for most of the day and waking up around 3, that kind of thing. But I didn't. And even on an animal level, right, my cats might have an instinct to, run from the vacuum. Yeah. But they don't always necessarily, because sometimes the food is on the other side of the vacuum and they will run by it instead of away from it. Right? So even at this sub-rational level, there's some kind of, some instincts overruling others. So it's not as simple as that. I want to look at the crab's behavior. I'll just move it to here and pause so I can keep pointing to it. I want to look at the crab's behavior in terms of the powers that it in fact has. Right? So the crab has a vegetative soul. Right? It has nutritive and reproductive capacities. Clearly, it's exercising them. It has sensitive and animate powers. In other words, it has sensation. It can see things. It can feel things. And it has animate powers. It can move around. It can move itself. It can auto-locomote. Now, it doesn't have rational or political powers. It doesn't have the capability of self-reflection or abstraction. It doesn't have the capability of working together with other crabs for a common purpose. Right? It doesn't have the ability to form community. Right? And that is, now worth noting, that is where some of our obligations to our children come from. Right? It's from this part. But we also have some kinds of obligations from this part, which this crab, I would argue, is violating. This crab is acting unnaturally. This is a fairly common behavior among its species. Not universal by any stretch of the imagination, but this is a common thing that this species of crab does. Just like infanticide is a common thing that humans have done throughout the ages, right? It's common. Doesn't mean that it's natural. Why? What is wrong with the crab eating its young? And again, wrong here because it's merely an animal. We're not passing moral fault, but we're doing something that's, relevantly similar. We're saying that the crab is doing something against its nature. Why is that?
Would it be violating its reproduction nature by
Yep.
Eating its own.
Yeah, so it's doing a lot of stuff wrong down here. Right. So, reproduction, what does that do?
create more things?
Yeah, makes more crabs. Okay? What does nutrition do?
Sustain the body.
Yeah, the crab sustains itself. So what it's doing here is it is using its nutritive powers, right, its ability to eat, to counteract its reproductive powers. It is acting against a part of its nature. Worse still, all these baby crabs, where do they come from?
Is that your question?
No, it's an obvious question.
Oh. Mom?
Yeah, they came from this crab, and she's eating them. Does anyone see the biological issue here?
It's like you're eating yourself.
Kind of. Well, let me put it this way. It takes a pretty significant amount of energy to produce young, right? Even for a crab that produces this many of them. So a crab produces a bunch of young. That takes a considerable amount of energy and nutrients, and in other words, stuff that the nutritive power is taking in. Then it pops them out in the form of baby crabs using its reproductive powers. Then it takes them back in. What happens when you use, let me put it this way. What happens when you use the outputs of a machine to try and power the machine that's making the outputs? In other words, what happens when you try and make a perpetual motion machine? Anyone ever try this in middle school or whatever? No? So think of it like, let me give you an analogy. Think if you have a factory that is using energy to produce some kind of synthetic petroleum, say gasoline, synthetic gasoline. It's making it, right? It's making synthetic gas. Suppose further that the factory runs completely on synthetic gasoline, the same stuff that it outputs. Why can't it just use the outputs to power the factory, to make more?
Because then it just kind of goes in a circular motion and there's no way for it to like go out and be bought or anything else.
True, but it's worse than that. Do I have a... No. No, I don't. Okay. It's worse than that because we have diminishing returns when we produce stuff. Right? The production of stuff requires energy, and if we're using the output to provide that energy, we're going to have less and less and less and less and less. So this is an analogous situation, because what the crab is doing is producing offspring, which have their own purposes, right? They're for growing up into big crabs, which then will go on to produce offspring of their own. Then what the crab is doing here is she's, instead of allowing them to grow up into large crabs, she's eating them. So she's outputting young crabs and then eating them for her own nutrition. Think of it this way. If you were starving, like on the brink of starvation, and you decided to eat your arm, how'd that go? Not terribly well. First of all, it wouldn't handle it terribly well. I don't think there's any creature, including these, whose nutritive capacities, right, their digestive systems are designed to subsist on themselves. But that's basically what the crab is doing. So beyond just your digestion is not going to handle it well, what you're doing is you're expending a good amount of your body's own resources to replenish a smaller amount of your body's own resources. So what's happening here is that the crab is reproducing. But it's also trying to take in nutrients by taking back in the nutrients it has just expended, but with a loss of efficiency at every stage. So what's happening here is not only contrary to reproduction, contrary to its reproductive capacities, because it's, making new crabs and then destroying them, but it's also contrary to its nutritive function. Because why do you take in nutrients? Well, it's to do things. In this case, if we're going to narrow our focus, we can talk about its capacity to reproduce. It needs to take in nutrients in order to do that, but what it's doing is it's now, let's say, recycling those nutrients at a lower level of efficiency. It's not taking in nutrients in the way that it ought to. It's acting contrary to its nutritive function. In other words, what the crab is doing is it's pitting these two powers against one another so that neither of them work properly. So I use this example as a kind of amoral example before we get into ethics per se, human behavior. So I can point out that we can look at the nature of something and we can see, well, what's wrong with what it's doing, even if what it's doing seems natural in a sense, right? It's the kind of thing that it ordinarily does. So we can look to human behavior in the same way. So let's look to humans eating, and I'm not going to put any kind of videos of humans eating their own young. I'm not even going to consider that much of an aberrant example. Instead, we're going to go back to the example that we were talking about earlier in the week, which is what if I were to grind up this expo marker and eat it? What is wrong with me grinding up the expo marker and eating it? Why shouldn't I do that? Probably. What's wrong with that? Why should I not make myself sick?
Because it doesn't benefit you at all?
Further than that,
You're causing harm to yourself.
yeah, I'm doing all sorts of harm to myself, right? Precisely what I'm doing is I'm using my nutritive capacity, my ability to take in nutrients, against nutrition. Right? So I'm not just not taking in nutrients. I'm using my nutritive powers to not take in nutrients. I'm using my nutritive powers in a way that actually, harms my digestion, say. It doesn't just not help, it in fact hurts. Similarly, I'm using my animate powers. I'm putting the marker into the blender and I'm putting it into my mouth and I'm chewing and swallowing against my sensitive powers. Because my God, would that taste really bad. And that's morally significant to an extent, right? Doing something for the sake of, tasting it, but let me put it this way. You wouldn't intentionally eat something or taste something just because, you wanted to taste it if you know it's terrible. Right? This is why when we were immature and maybe still, we do the whole you smell something and then you recoil horribly and you're like, here, smell this. We've all seen the skit, right? Or something doing that. But the point of why that's funny and unexpected is because what you're doing is you're expecting someone to intentionally do something they would have no intention to do otherwise. And you're just sort of tricking them into it for humor. Right? Further, eating the expo marker is irrational because, well, there's a good chance that would impede my judgment in some sense, and it would also, in addition to representing a lapse in judgment, it was a bad choice to do it, it also it'll probably impede my ability to think. In a similar way to if I just open the cap of the marker and inhale deeply repeatedly, it would have probably relatively similar effects. So, eating things that are not food is contrary to the natural law and wrong, and we shouldn't do it. The whole My Strange Addiction thing, that was this class, right? Someone mentioned that? I forget. Oh, she's not here. Got it. All that is morally wrong for a lot of reasons. Okay. Now, to more maybe common cases. Not everybody is going to be eating expo markers, but we might have issues with, say, gluttony, overeating. Okay, what's wrong with it? Okay.
There's all sorts of effects.
Yeah, right, so overeating has all kinds of negative effects. So let's break it down and look at individually, what are you doing? Okay, so you eat food when you're hungry. You eat. You're nourished. Great, you've done something good. But then when you overeat, something further continues to happen. You keep eating when you're not hungry, when in fact you're full. What is happening in terms of all of this? What are you doing?
You're going against your body, telling you it's full, and you're like, no, I'm just gonna eat more.
Yeah, so you're ignoring certain sensations that you have for the sake of others, probably, because it just tastes so damn good, so you're going to keep going and ignore that sensation of being full. So you're posing your senses against one another. Shouldn't do that. You're also posing nutrition against itself. You're taking in nutrients, but it's counterproductive, because the purpose of taking in nutrients is to maintain one's health, and if you're overeating in the short term or the long term, whichever the case may be, that's detrimental to your health. Right? Like if you don't have a habit of overeating and you have one freakishly enormous meal, you're going to be feeling it for a while. It's not going to be a happy time. Right? It's detrimental to you. If you make a habit of it, it can have long-term health problems. Right? This as well. In addition, there are rational problems to overeating. One, you're miscalculating how much you should eat. Right? You're being imprudent, to put it in the virtue terms. But then also, you're in a sense violating your political community, because you're taking more than you need. And it's not just more than you need, you're taking more than you can practically make use of. So when you eat a lot, that's something that someone else can't eat. Right? Food is a pretty excludable good. So what's happening is for example, you're saying, all right, for the sake of one particular sensation, right, it tasting good, or maybe indulging a habit, or even for the sake of, let's say, some kind of communal activity, right? Having a meal. Right, a meal together, even though you just ate, but I want to eat with everyone, so you continue. You're pitting parts of yourself against one another. You're dividing yourself. So it's not just that you're harming yourself, which that's generally speaking that's true, but it goes further than that. It's that you're using nutrition for non-nutritive purposes. You're sharing a meal, which is a communal or a political end, but at the same time, you're taking away what could be someone else's. So you're contradictory there. You're opposed to yourself. Similarly, your sensitive parts are opposed to your senses, let's say, are opposed to one another. You're feeling full, but you're feeling pleasure from eating. So So what's happening is you're splitting yourself. You're no longer a coherent whole person. You're a bunch of parts fighting each other. That's its own kind of harm that isn't, well, harm in a sense, that isn't just, I'm eating too much and I'm not going to feel good about it. Right? It's a different kind of thing. All right. That's another example. So another analogous example. So going to the having a meal together thing. So if you are full, if you just ate, and then somebody says, "Hey, you want to grab something to eat?" What do? Yeah?
Ask them what we got.
Yeah, it depends on the food.
That's not good.
Well, if you're like, oh, we're gonna go get sushi, then I'm gonna be like, okay, like, let's go. But,
Oh, well.
because if I eat at the Calf, and they don't really have a lot of things all the time, and so I'll probably just like have like a sandwich or something. Then if they say, oh, let's go get sushi, then I'm gonna go get sushi. I just might
Okay.
not eat a lot of sushi, but I'll still.
Okay. See, so that's reasonable, is going and not overeating, right? Not eating much.
Yeah.
Ordering a roll and a drink or something.
Well, sometimes you feel obligated to eat more too. Like if you go to like Koizi, I don't know if you guys know what that is.
Love it.
Frickin' bomb.
Absolutely
okay?
love it. Highly recommend it. It is the place to go if you ever feel like being horrible in this sense.
Yeah.
Perfect. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
But if you go to somewhere like that and you're paying like, if you don't get their lunch special, you're paying like $18, $19 for an unlimited experience.
Go for lunch. It's like
Yeah, go before
$9.50 or
3:30.
something. It's like $9.50 or something. It's much better.
Fucking awesome. But anyways,
It's true.
you feel more obligated to eat more because you're paying such a high price. So
Yep.
if you go and have one sushi roll, you're gonna look like an idiot paying $19 for sushi and a water.
It's true. I think they have an a la carte option, but interestingly, I don't think it has to be everyone ordering a la carte at a table
Yeah,
or
I
something
do
like
think
that.
so.
So that actually kind of encourages this problem, interestingly. Which, yeah, you've got a kind of your ends are opposed to one another, right? So you shouldn't want to overeat, right? Because it's bad for all the reasons we've gone over. But at the same time, you ought to develop friendships and things like that. That's a good thing. And a lot of times that involves sharing a meal, right? That's how we human beings do this nutrition thing. That's our distinctive way of taking in nutrients given our rational and communal natures, sharing a meal. So that's a good thing. That's absolutely the kind of thing that a human being should do. But it could be contrary to other purposes, and you have to avoid that where possible. And again, natural law doesn't necessarily hold as strictly to the ought implies can principle that we've talked about before. You can maybe have somewhat conflicting obligations. That, well, no, you ought to, socialize properly and eat to the extent that it's, hospitable and, sharing a good meal together, but then also shouldn't overeat. And if you just ate and then someone asked you to go to lunch, well, you shouldn't have eaten, even though you couldn't have known. Right? So this is an evaluative procedure, and you can say, look, you shouldn't have done this other thing. Even though you already did it, you had no way of knowing that you should have avoided it, etc. You can look back and say, well, I wish I hadn't eaten. And that's, in a sense, passing a moral judgment on yourself. You should, a way around that is to consider situations more fully, perhaps. All right. So we've covered some things about violence, political community, not hitting each other. We've covered things about food. Do we want to go controversial or do we want to go non-controversial? Let's go for it. All right, let's talk about sex. How many people regret saying controversial? All right, how do we have sex? Naturally.
Okay, naturally. You know, between a man and
I mean, you don't
woman,
need to go into like physical details, but
there's insertion, penetration.
okay, it's more complicated than that. It's a lot more complicated than that. In which case, maybe if that's all there is to it, you're doing it wrong. In the same way that, yeah, no, I'm not even kidding. In the same way that, you know, starting a fight is doing discourse wrong, simple insertion is doing sex wrong for a human being. Because what are humans? What are we? Again? That's it. Yeah, we're that, but we're more than that. We're kind of animal. We're rational animals. Animals do the insertion thing, right? If that's all there is to it, then that's here. We're good. Right? There's reproductive powers at work, and then there's sensitive and animate powers at work, right? All of this. Yeah?
So then we find like a suitable mate,
Yep, that's still sensitive though.
decide to do the dirty, and then
Not necessarily though. Usually, yeah, it should. Because why? Why is love important?
Because maybe like an animal can't really feel love. They just
Okay, but why is it important for our rational nature?
because they're not just throwing themselves around. I don't know.
It's true, right? So it involves, all right, so it involves a kind of political community. You're forming a community between you and the other party. A particular kind of community. A kind of community which is pretty fundamental to human society called a family. Yeah. Well, then you're trying to do something wrong. Here we go. Look, so again, we looked at this. We said that each of these powers is expanded on, done differently as you add more things on top of it. So plants can reproduce, animals can insert, and even seek out a mate. Right? Humans do something else that animals don't do, and it's not necessarily the feeling of love, right? Lots of animals pair bond.
Well, humans with fun, I guess.
Yeah, but there's a lot of animals that do it for fun, in a weird sense. Yeah. But again, even that's here. That's solidly here. Very solidly here. Humans do this distinctive thing called marrying. We do this thing called forming a family. Right? Because, here's what happens. We have this reproductive capacity. The purpose of reproduction, on a merely vegetative level, is to produce more of the things that we are. So then, we move up to a sensitive level, an animal level. That involves things like seeking out a good mate. It involves things like physical pleasure. It involves things like evaluating that mate with senses. And it involves things like acknowledging the young and having some interaction with the young. Then we go up here. And that involves more. It involves bringing it. Now, note, it still involves all of this. Right? It does. Then it also involves bringing another human into the human community that you've formed. It involves a rational decision to enter into a kind of relationship. It involves rearing a child, right? So teaching, education of a child. That's part of sex for humans. Now, if you're just doing this, you're punching somebody in the face, relatively speaking. I mean, it's a bit of an analogy. You see how it works, right? So this is where all of this comes from. And again, this is where all of this, traditional sexual morality stuff comes from. Because human beings are distinct. We're things. We're a particular kind of thing with particular rational powers that involve a lot of things and then make use of these things for particular ends. All right, so what if we are Well, here's a thought. What if we're not doing this part? Yeah, what if we're not doing the reproducing part? Contraception. I'm talking about contraception. I'm talking about... Why is that? What's unnatural, so to speak? And again, unnatural, again, doesn't just mean that it's, artificial or it's imposed or whatever. No, not caring about that. Irrelevant. My contact lenses are unnatural in that sense. But unnatural in this sense. Not part of one's holistic nature. What's up with that? How do we say that?
Well, because contraception is not stopping what should come out of sex.
Yeah, you're using your reproductive capacities purely for the sake of sensation and maybe community. Maybe. Though, again, probably not, but maybe. So what you're doing is you're saying, yeah, the thing that I'm, let's say, byproduct of the reproductive process is what I'm seeking and not the actual reproductive process. In fact, I'm acting against that process. It's not just that I'm, not seeking it. I'm actively going against it. So let me go for another analogy, which is another thing to look at in natural law. So we talked about eating, we talked about overeating. What about fasting? It's Lent right now. Some of us are probably fasting from some things. Is that wrong? You're not exercising your nutritive capacity to the extent that you're fasting.
Some religions it isn't wrong.
Well,
For them,
now maybe we can say something like, yeah, all right, fine, we're doing something that's unnatural in the natural law sense for the sake of some higher purpose. But that's a weird sacrifice if whatever religion we're talking about claims that God is good. And as far as I know, every religion that practices fasting thinks of the divine as good, right? And the divine as wanting us to be good. So that's weird. That's like saying that, you ought to sin to worship God. Careful there. Don't think we want to say that. Here's the difference. Fasting, what do you do when you're fasting? Correct. Nothing. Right? You're not eating. That's it. Right? It's that simple. What you're not doing is eating an expo marker. Or you're not making yourself throw up. You're not acting contrary to your nutritive powers. You're just not exercising them. There's nothing particularly wrong with that. It's the choice to not exercise them for some other goal. It's not that you're setting your rational power against your nutritive power. What you're doing is you're using your rational power to decide when and how to exercise your nutritive power. It's worth noting that most religions that do require fasting, and I think all of those that even encourage fasting, would say that you can fast to excess. There's a point at which not eating becomes bad, and that's where you start starving. And that you shouldn't do that. Right? Hence, I know at least Catholicism and Islam both have abrogations of fasting requirements for people who are not in good health, that kind of thing, right? Because it would be detrimental to them. And that's not the point. The point isn't to actually hurt yourself. So, five minutes. Okay. So if I'm going to sum up natural law requirements for any given thing, any given human action, it's that none of our powers, attributes, abilities, etc., should be in conflict with one another. We should be using our vegetative capacities for vegetative purposes in a sensitive and rational way, We should be using our sensitive and animate capacities in a vegetative and rational way. We should be using our rational capacities in a sensitive and vegetative way. We shouldn't split ourselves apart and propose opposite ends or opposite goals for ourselves. Especially, we shouldn't use the same power we have for opposite purposes. Right? Overeating is a great example of this. Contraception is a great example of this. Self-deception is a great example of this. Right? Using your rational capacities to undermine your rationality. Another great example of this is drunkenness. Getting drunk, getting thoroughly wasted. What are you doing there?
Having fun.
You're having fun, which is a rational end, right? Having fun, especially if you're having a good time with friends and you're doing recreation stuff, that's a rational end. There's nothing wrong with that. What happens is when you start doing that to the point where it impairs your rational capacities, right? To the point where you can't think straight. You also can say, well, you're experiencing some positive sensations, but then also you're numbing your sensations by overdrinking. You're taking in nutrients, you're also kind of doing the opposite. Right? You're doing the opposite in a couple of senses. One, because excessive alcohol isn't healthy for you to start with, and then also you might throw up, which is you're using your nutritive powers to expel nutrients instead of taking them in. Right? So all these are good examples we can see of looking at kinds of behaviors which are, in this relevant sense, unnatural. They go against human nature. It's also worth noting that plenty of these things that we're talking about are perfectly well in accord with animal nature, merely animal nature, or merely vegetative nature. Right? If it's something that is, well, for example, if there's nothing in particular wrong with an animal not eating when another animal is eating, right? But if you're sitting there across from the dinner table with someone and you have a glass of water and they're eating a meal, you're at the very least being rude to them. You're damaging your relationship to some extent. It's rude.